The sky over the reservoir cracked open like glass, and Walter Higgins dropped his flashlight in the mud. He had heard the sound first, a screeching whine that rattled the windows of his cabin and sent his old dog scrambling under the porch. Walter had lived alone on this land for 11 years, ever since he retired from his job as a forest ranger, and in all that time, he had never heard a sound like this one. It was not a plane. It was not thunder. It was something tearing through the air, fast and wounded, and it was heading straight for the trees behind his house. He grabbed his rifle out of habit more than fear, the same way he always did when something moved in the dark that he could not explain, and he ran out into the cold night barefoot, his heart slamming against his ribs. The trees lit up orange, then white, then nothing at all. A deep boom rolled across the water and bounced off the hills. Birds exploded out of the branches in every direction, screaming as they went. Walter stood frozen at the edge of his yard, staring at the smoke rising over the tree line. Every instinct in his body told him to go back inside, lock the door, and call someone in the morning, when the sun was up and the world made sense again. But something else pulled at him, some old ranger instinct that refused to let a fire burn unchecked in his woods, and before he could talk himself out of it, he was already moving toward it. The smell hit him before he reached the clearing. It was sharp and metallic, like a struck match mixed with burnt rubber, except wrong somehow, unlike anything he had smelled before. He pushed through the last row of pine trees and stopped so suddenly that his boots skidded in the dirt. There, in the middle of a scorched circle of broken branches and smoldering grass, sat a shape that made no sense to him. It looked like a piece of folded metal, dark and curved, taller than his truck, with thin lines of blue light pulsing along its surface like veins. Steam hissed out of a crack along its side. Walter's mind scrambled for an explanation. A weather balloon, a military test, a drone that had gone wrong. None of it fit. None of it came close. Then something moved inside the wreckage, and Walter's whole body went cold. A shape unfolded itself from the broken hull, tall and thin, with long limbs that bent in places human limbs did not bend. Its skin looked smooth and gray under the moonlight, almost like wet stone, and its head was narrow, with two large dark eyes that caught the light strangely. It stumbled as it stepped free of the wreck, one arm pressed tight against its side, dark liquid seeping between its long fingers. Walter raised his rifle without thinking. His hands shook so badly the barrel wobbled in the air. The creature's head snapped toward him instantly. It did not raise its hands or make any move Walter could call threatening. Instead, it staggered a step closer, its breath coming out in short, ragged bursts that sounded almost like sobbing, and it opened its mouth and screamed a question at him in broken, guttural English that seemed to scrape its way out of a throat never built to form human words. "Did you harm human children?" Walter's finger froze on the trigger. For a moment he thought he had imagined it, that fear and shock had twisted some animal noise into words that were never really there. But the creature said it again, louder this time, more desperate, stepping closer, even as it swayed on its feet from whatever injury was bleeding beneath its hand. "Did you harm human children? Tell me now." Walter's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. His mind was a storm of static, unable to hold on to a single clear thought. He was standing in his own woods, at nearly midnight, pointing a rifle at something that should not exist, and it was accusing him of hurting children. Somewhere in the chaos of his thoughts, a strange clarity broke through, sharp and simple. Whatever this was, it was not asking him for help. It was demanding an answer, as if the answer mattered more than its own life. "No," Walter finally managed to say, his voice cracking. "No, I haven't hurt anybody. I don't even know what you're talking about." The creature's dark eyes studied him for a long moment, and Walter had the unsettling sense that it was reading something in his face, some signal only it could see. Slowly, the tension in its long body eased, just slightly, though its breathing remained fast and shallow. It lowered itself down onto one knee, not in a gesture of surrender, but as though its strength had finally run out. Walter lowered the rifle an inch, though every nerve in his body screamed at him not to. "Who are you?" he asked. "What are you?" The creature lifted its head. There was something in its expression that Walter would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who would never believe him. It was not calm. It was closer to grief, mixed with urgency. mixed with something that looked almost like shame. "There is no time," the creature said, forcing each word out like it was dragging them up from somewhere deep and painful. "I followed a signal, a call for help. From here. From this land." Walter's stomach twisted. "What signal?" he asked. "There's nothing out here but my cabin and the old summer camp down the ridge. That place has been closed for years." The creature's head turned sharply toward the direction Walter had pointed, toward the dark line of hills where the abandoned camp sat rotting behind a rusted gate. Its whole body seemed to go rigid, and for the first time since it had crawled out of the wreckage, real fear crossed its face, an expression so raw and recognizable that for a moment, Walter forgot it wasn't human at all. "That is where the signal began," the creature said. "That is where they were taken." Walter's blood ran cold. "Taken," he repeated. "Taken by who?" The creature struggled to its feet again, swaying, one hand still pressed to the wound at its side. It looked past Walter, toward the sky, toward the thin trail of smoke still curling up from the wreckage behind it, and its whole posture changed, sharpening into something like alertness, like fear, that had turned into readiness. "We do not have time for the whole story," it said. "Others followed me here. They will not stop the way I stopped. They will finish what they came to do, unless we reach the children first." Walter took a step back without meaning to. "Children," he said again, the word catching in his throat. "What children? Whose children?" The creature's dark eyes locked onto his, and its voice dropped, quieter now, but somehow more frightening for it. "Human children," it said, "3 of them, taken from this world 2 nights ago. I tracked the ones responsible here, to stop them, but I did not stop them in time, and now something worse is coming to finish the collection." For a moment, Walter could not breathe. His mind flew immediately to the local news he had half listened to over dinner 2 nights before. A story about children missing from a nearby town. A story he had barely paid attention to because these things always seemed to happen somewhere else, to someone else, never close enough to touch his quiet corner of the world. Now it was standing in front of him, bleeding, terrified, and telling him that the horror was real, and it was here. "You're saying kids are missing," he said slowly, testing the words as if saying them out loud might make them false. "And you think they're near my property?" "I know they are," the creature said. "My scanners tracked the signal to this land before my ship was struck. I do not have much time before my pursuers arrive, and when they do, they will not ask questions the way I did. They will not care if you are innocent. They will only care about finishing what was started." Walter stared at the creature, and slowly, terribly, the pieces began falling into place in his mind, forming a picture he did not want to see. He thought of the strange trucks he had noticed near the old camp gate over the past month, trucks he had assumed belonged to contractors clearing brush. He thought of the flickering lights he had seen through the tree line some nights, lights he had blamed on kids sneaking in to party. He thought of every small, strange thing he had noticed and dismissed, because it was easier to look away than to ask questions. "Show me," he said, his voice steadier now, even as his hands still trembled around the rifle. "Show me where you tracked that signal." The creature nodded once, sharply, and began moving toward the tree line with a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond its injury, beyond its exhaustion, beyond anything Walter could understand. As Walter turned to follow, he cast one last glance back at the smoking wreck behind them, at the thin trail of dark smoke rising into a sky that no longer felt safe or familiar. Somewhere above the clouds, though neither of them could yet see it, something else had already begun its descent, drawn by the same signal, moving with none of the hesitation the wounded creature had shown. It was coming fast, and it was coming for the same reason. Walter did not know that yet. He only knew that his quiet life beside a quiet reservoir had ended the moment he stepped into the woods, and that whatever happened next, there was no walking back from it. He gripped his rifle tighter and followed the stranger into the dark, toward a camp he had passed 1,000 times without a second thought, now carrying a fear heavier than anything he had ever known. Behind him, the wreckage ticked and hissed as it cooled, and far above, unseen, a second light began to fall from the stars. The creature moved through the trees with a strange, uneven grace, favoring its wounded side, and Walter found himself struggling to keep pace, despite knowing this land better than anyone alive. He had walked these woods since he was a boy, had mapped every fallen log and deer trail in his mind without ever meaning to. Yet tonight the forest felt foreign, hostile, as though it too sensed that something had gone terribly wrong. "Tell me your name," Walter said, mostly to keep his mind from spiraling into panic. Talking felt like the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. The creature did not slow its pace. "Ver," it said, or something close enough to that sound that Walter's human mouth could shape it. "That is the closest word your language allows." "Ver," Walter repeated. "All right. Ver. You said you tracked a signal here. What kind of signal?" "A distress call," Ver said. "A frequency used by those who move captives between worlds. It is old technology, crude, meant to alert buyers when a delivery is ready. I have hunted this signal before, on other worlds, in other systems. I did not expect to hear it here, on a world that has not yet reached the stars." Walter's stomach turned. "You're saying whoever took those kids is selling them," he said, forcing the words out even though they tasted like poison. "To something. To someone from wherever you're from." "Not from where I am from," Ver said sharply, and for the first time something like anger flashed across its narrow face. "My kind hunts these traffickers. We have hunted them across a dozen worlds, because when they cannot find buyers among the stars, they turn to worlds like yours. Worlds too young to know they are being watched, too young to defend what is taken from them. I came here to stop a transaction before it completed. I failed to stop it in time. That is why I crashed. That is why I am bleeding in your forest instead of standing over the ones responsible." Walter absorbed this in silence, his boots crunching over dead leaves as they climbed the ridge toward the old camp. He wanted to ask 100 questions, wanted to know how long this had been happening, how many worlds, how many children. But the fear pressing against his chest allowed only one question to surface. "Are they still alive?" he asked quietly. "The kids, are they still alive?" Ver's steps slowed for just a moment. "I do not know," it admitted. "The signal I followed came from a holding point, not a departure point. If the transaction had already completed, I would not have found this world in time to matter. There is still a chance. That is the only reason I have not given up." They crested the ridge, and below them, bathed in cold moonlight, the old summer camp came into view. Walter had passed the rusted gate 100 times over the years, always driving by without a second glance, telling himself someone would eventually tear the place down. Now the sight of it filled him with a dread he had never associated with those quiet, decaying buildings before. The mess hall's roof had partially collapsed years ago. The cabins stood in crooked rows, windows broken, doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. It looked exactly like it always had. That was somehow the worst part. "How do you know they're here?" Walter asked, his voice barely above a whisper now, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something waiting in the dark below. Ver lifted one long arm, and a thin device wrapped around its wrist began to glow faintly, projecting a soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. "This tracks residual energy signatures," it said. "The device used to hold captives leaves a trace even after it is deactivated. The strongest trace is there." It pointed toward the mess hall, toward the section where the roof had caved in years before, and Walter felt his throat tighten. He had walked past that building a dozen times as a kid, back when the camp was still open, back when it had been full of laughter, and flashlight tag and burnt marshmallows instead of whatever horror had settled into its bones now. "We need to call the police," Walter said suddenly, the practical part of his mind finally catching up with the panic. "Real police, with real backup. I have a phone in my truck. We can be there in 10 minutes. This isn't something the two of us can do alone." Ver turned to him, and there was something almost pleading in its expression now. Something that made Walter's chest ache, despite everything strange and impossible about the creature standing before him. "There is no time for that," Ver said. "My pursuers are already descending. If your authorities arrive and see what is coming, they will either be killed trying to stop it, or they will panic and cause the very outcome we are trying to prevent. I need to reach the children before anyone else arrives, human or otherwise. Please. I did not save enough lives on other worlds to fail on this one too." Walter hesitated, torn between every rational instinct telling him to run back to his truck and call for help, and the strange, undeniable pull of the fear in Ver's voice, a fear that felt too raw, too real, to be anything but genuine. He thought of the missing children from the news broadcast, their faces flashing briefly on his television screen before he had changed the channel, too tired after a long day to sit with the discomfort of it. He thought of how easy it had been to look away then, and how impossible it felt to look away now. "All right," Walter said finally, gripping his rifle tighter. "Show me where to go. But if this goes wrong, we're calling for backup the second we can." "Agreed," Ver said, and together they began their descent down the ridge toward the broken camp below. As they moved closer, Walter noticed details he had never registered from the road. The grass around the mess hall had been trampled recently, flattened in wide, unnatural patches, as though heavy equipment had been dragged across it. Tire tracks cut deep into the mud near the old kitchen entrance, tracks far too fresh to belong to the camp's original owners, who had abandoned the property years ago. A chain, newer than everything else around it, wrapped around the mess hall's back door, secured with a padlock that gleamed faintly under Ver's wrist light. "Someone's been using this place," Walter murmured, more to himself than to Ver. "Recently. Real recently." Ver crouched beside the chained door, running its long fingers along the lock without touching it directly, studying it with an intensity that reminded Walter of a predator sizing up prey. "This was placed within the last few days," Ver said. "The metal has not yet begun to rust the way the rest of this structure has. Whoever did this intended to return." Walter's mind raced through every awkward, unremarkable memory of the past month, searching for anything he had dismissed too easily. The strange trucks, the lights through the trees, a man he had seen once at the gas station in town, someone he did not recognize, who had stared at him a beat too long before driving off toward the ridge road. None of it had seemed important at the time. All of it felt suddenly, unbearably important now. "We need to get through that door," Walter said, hefting his rifle by the barrel, ready to use it as a tool rather than a weapon if it came to breaking the lock. Before he could move, Ver's head snapped upward sharply, its dark eyes locking onto the sky above the tree line. Its whole body went rigid, every muscle tensing at once, and the fear that crossed its face this time was unlike anything Walter had seen from it before, deeper and colder than the desperation it had shown at the crash site. "What?" Walter asked, following its gaze, seeing nothing but stars and drifting clouds. "What is it?" "They found me faster than I expected," Ver said, its voice dropping to something close to a whisper, though there was no mistaking the terror underneath it. "We have less time than I hoped. Much less." Walter looked up again, straining his eyes against the darkness, and for a moment he saw nothing at all. Then, faint and distant, he caught it, a single point of light moving against the drift of the clouds, too steady, too deliberate, to be a star or a plane. It grew brighter as he watched, and larger, and it was undeniably, unmistakably, headed straight down toward them. "Whatever it is," Walter said, his mouth suddenly dry, "it's coming fast." Ver rose to its full height beside him, injury forgotten for the moment, replaced by something sharp and focused that Walter could only describe as readiness for a fight it did not want, but would not run from. "We need to move now," Ver said, "before they land, before they realize we already know they are here." Walter nodded, adrenaline drowning out the last of his hesitation, and together they turned back toward the chained door, working quickly now, aware that whatever time they had left was shrinking with every passing second, and that somewhere inside that broken building, 3 children were waiting for someone, anyone, to come and find them before it was too late. Walter drove the stock of his rifle against the padlock twice before it finally snapped loose, the sound echoing sharper than he wanted through the still night air. He froze for a second, listening, half expecting shouts or footsteps to answer the noise, but only silence and the distant call of an owl greeted them. Ver pulled the chain free and eased the heavy door open, wincing as the movement pulled at the wound along its side. Inside, the mess hall smelled of mildew and rust, the same smell Walter remembered from childhood summers, except now it carried something else underneath, something sour and wrong that made the back of his throat tighten. Broken tables lay stacked against one wall, their surfaces coated in dust except for a cleared path leading toward the kitchen at the rear of the building. Someone had walked this path recently, and often. Ver moved ahead of him, wrist device glowing brighter now, pulsing faster as they crossed the room. "This way," Ver said quietly. The signal strengthens here. They reached the kitchen, and Walter's flashlight beam swept across rusted stoves and empty shelves until it landed on something that did not belong. A section of the floor, near the old walk-in freezer, looked different from the rest. The tile cleaner, newer, laid over something that had clearly been added long after the camp closed. Ver crouched beside it, running its fingers along the seam until it found a recessed handle, disguised beneath a loose tile. Walter helped pull it open, his muscles straining against a hidden weight, and beneath it, a set of narrow concrete stairs descended into darkness. Cold air rushed up to meet them, carrying with it a smell that made Walter's stomach clench, something metallic and stale, the smell of a place that had held people against their will. "Stay close," Walter murmured, though he was not sure if he was reassuring Veer or himself. They descended together, Walter's flashlight cutting through the dark, and at the bottom they found a narrow corridor, lined with what had once been storage rooms, now converted into something far worse. Thin mattresses lay on the floor of one room, along with a child's shoe, small and pink, lying on its side near the doorway, as though it had been kicked off in a struggle. Walter's hand tightened around his rifle, until his knuckles ached. "They were here," Ver said quietly, kneeling beside the shoe without touching it, studying the space around it with an intensity Walter found unsettling. "Recently. Within the last day. Perhaps less." "Are they still here?" Walter asked, though he already feared the answer. Ver's wrist device pulsed erratically, the light flickering between soft blue and a harsher amber. "The signal here has gone cold," Ver said. "This was a holding point, not the final one. They were moved." "Moved where?" Walter demanded, his voice rising despite himself. Ver straightened, turning slowly, scanning the narrow corridor as though searching for something only it could sense. "There is a secondary trace, fainter, leading east, toward higher ground. There is a structure there, an opening in the earth, something your world would call a quarry." Walter's mind flashed immediately to the old stone quarry half a mile past the camp, abandoned since before he was born, its deep pit long since filled with stagnant water, and its edges lined with crumbling equipment sheds that local teenagers used as a dare to explore. He had walked its perimeter a dozen times over the years, chasing off trespassers, never once imagining it could hide something like this. "I know that place," Walter said. "We can reach it on foot in 15 minutes if we cut through the tree line instead of the road." Ver nodded, then paused, its head tilting as though listening to something Walter could not hear. Before either of them could move, a low, distant rumble rolled through the ground beneath their feet, faint but unmistakable, growing steadily louder. "That is not thunder," Ver said, its voice tightening with alarm. They climbed back up the narrow stairs as fast as Walter's aching legs would carry him, bursting out of the mess hall into the open camp, just in time to see a second light breaking through the clouds above the ridge, larger and darker than the wreckage Veer had left behind, moving with a controlled, deliberate descent that Walter's crashed guide had not managed. It hovered for a moment above the tree line, casting a cold white glow across the abandoned cabins, before angling sharply toward the far side of the ridge, toward the quarry. "They know where the children were moved," Ver said, dread thick in its voice. "They are heading to complete the collection before we can stop them." Walter felt his chest tighten with a fear unlike anything he had known before, sharper and more immediate than his earlier confusion at the crash site. This was no longer an abstract horror unfolding somewhere else, in some other town, on some other night. This was happening now, above his own land, with children's lives hanging in the balance of how fast two mismatched strangers could move through the dark. "Why are they doing this?" Walter asked as they broke into a run along the tree line, unable to hold the question back any longer. What could they possibly want with human children? Ver's long legs carried it easily alongside him despite its injury, though its breathing had grown ragged again. "There are buyers across many worlds who value what they call untouched innocence," Ver said, each word clipped and bitter. "They believe children from young worlds carry something rare, something they cannot replicate or manufacture. It is a vile trade, built on cruelty dressed up as commerce. My people have spent generations hunting those who deal in it, dismantling their networks wherever we find them. But for every network broken, another rises in its place. This world was never supposed to be found. Somehow, someone found a way in." Walter's fists clenched at his sides as they ran, fury beginning to burn through his fear. How? He demanded. How does someone even reach a world like ours to do something like this? There are those among my kind who have grown wealthy trading knowledge they should never have shared, Ver admitted, shame heavy in its voice. Star charts, travel routes, access codes to worlds not yet ready for contact. I do not know who sold the path to this world, but I intend to find out, once the children are safe. They crested a small hill, and below them the quarry came into view, its deep pit shrouded in mist that clung low to the still water at its center. The dark craft they had seen descending now sat motionless near the quarry's northern edge, its hull humming faintly, with the same pulsing light Walter had seen on Ver's wounded ship, though this one showed no damage at all. Figures moved near its base, tall and thin like Ver, but their movements were sharp, mechanical, utterly without the desperate humanity Ver had shown since the moment it crashed. There, Ver whispered, pointing toward a low equipment shed near the quarry's edge. Its metal roof rusted through in patches. That is where the secondary signal originates. The children are inside. Walter's heart pounded as he studied the scene, counting 3 figures near the ship, their attention fixed on something Walter could not yet see, a device propped on a tripod that blinked with the same amber light Ver's wrist device had shown moments before in the tunnel. They are preparing a transport beam, Ver said grimly. Once it activates, anyone within its range will be pulled aboard the ship. We do not have long. What do we do? Walter asked, his grip tightening around his rifle, even as a small, honest voice in the back of his mind admitted that a hunting rifle felt laughably small against whatever those figures represented. Ver turned to him, and despite the fear and exhaustion etched into its face, something steady and resolved settled into its expression, the look of someone who had made peace with a dangerous choice long before saying it out loud. I will draw their attention toward the ship, Ver said. It is the only way to buy enough time. While they focus on me, you move toward the shed and get the children out. Do not wait for me. Do not look back. Once you reach the tree line, do not stop until you are far from here. Walter shook his head immediately, panic flaring in his chest. That's suicide, he said. There's 3 of them and 1 of you, and you're already hurt. You won't last 30 seconds. I do not need 30 seconds, Ver said, a strange, tired calm settling over it. I need enough seconds for you to reach those children. That is the only outcome that matters tonight. Walter opened his mouth to argue further, to insist there had to be another way, some plan that did not require Ver to walk toward near certain harm, while he ran the other direction with a rifle he had never fired at anything more dangerous than a coyote. But before he could speak, the amber light on the tripod device below them flared brighter, pulsing faster, and one of the tall, sharp-moving figures near the ship turned its head slowly toward the hill where they crouched, as though it had sensed something watching. We are out of time, Ver said, rising to its feet despite the wound still weeping dark fluid along its side. Whatever you decide, decide now. Walter's heart hammered against his ribs as he stared down at the shed, at the faint outline of small shapes he could now make out through a gap in its rusted wall. 3 children huddled together in the dark, waiting for a rescue they did not know was coming. He thought of every moment over the past hour that had led him here, every strange sound and stranger sight, and realized with sudden, terrible clarity that there was no version of tonight where he walked away and pretended none of it had happened. All right, Walter said, his voice steadier than he felt. Let's go. They split apart at the base of the hill, Ver moving low and fast toward the dark ship while Walter angled wide, keeping to the shadows of broken machinery scattered around the quarry's edge, old cranes and rusted conveyor belts left behind decades ago, when the stone had all been dug out and sold. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his ears, drowning out almost everything except the crunch of gravel beneath his careful footsteps. He watched from behind a collapsed conveyor frame as Ver stepped fully into the open, arms raised, voice ringing out loud and clear across the quarry, in a language Walter did not understand, sharp and commanding, clearly meant to draw every eye toward itself. The 3 figures near the ship turned as one, their movements unnervingly synchronized, and for a moment, nobody moved at all. Predator and prey sizing each other up under the cold light of the hovering craft. Then one of the figures raised its arm, and a thin beam of white light lanced out toward Ver. who dove sideways with a speed Walter would not have believed possible from someone so badly injured. The beam scorched a black line into the gravel where Ver had stood a heartbeat earlier, and the quarry erupted into motion. Shouts and flashes of light, and the heavy thrum of the ship's engines spinning up in response to the sudden chaos. Walter did not wait to see more. He broke from his hiding place and ran low and fast toward the equipment shed, every instinct screaming at him to help Ver, every ounce of remaining logic reminding him that the fastest way to help anyone tonight was to reach those children before the transport beam activated. His boots pounded across uneven ground, his breath ragged, until finally he reached the shed's rusted door and threw his shoulder against it. The door gave way with a groan of protesting metal, and Walter stumbled into the dark, flashlight beam sweeping wildly, until it landed on 3 small figures huddled against the far wall, eyes wide with terror, arms wrapped around each other. A girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark curly hair matted against her forehead. A boy beside her, younger, silent tears streaking his dirt-smudged face. And an older boy, perhaps 11, positioned slightly in front of the other two, as though he had appointed himself their protector, despite being a captive himself. "It's all right," Walter said quickly, lowering his rifle and holding up his free hand, keeping his voice as calm and steady as he could manage, despite his own racing heart. "My name is Walter. I'm here to get you out. We need to move fast. Okay, can you walk?" The older boy nodded slowly, though his eyes darted past Walter toward the door, toward the chaos of light and noise still erupting outside. "They took us from the bus stop," he said, his voice shaking but clear. "2 nights ago. They said if we didn't stay quiet, they'd hurt Nora." "I believe you," Walter said gently, kneeling down to their level. "And you did good, all 3 of you, staying quiet and staying together. But right now I need you to trust me and move fast. Can you do that?" The girl, the one the older boy had called Nora, gave a small trembling nod, and the youngest boy copied her a moment later. Walter felt something in his chest crack open at the sight of their fear, replaced almost instantly by a fierce, protective determination he had not known he possessed until this exact moment. "Stay behind me, close," Walter said, rising and moving back toward the door, rifle raised again, senses straining against every shadow and sound outside. "We're going to move to the tree line and we are not stopping until we're there. Understand?" The children nodded together, and Walter eased the shed door open, peering out into a scene that made his blood run cold. Ver was on the ground near the base of the ship, one arm raised defensively as one of the sharp-moving figures advanced on it, another beam of white light scorching the earth mere inches from where Ver had rolled away just in time. The third figure had turned, its head angled toward the shed, toward Walter, as though it had finally registered movement where it should not be. Walter's stomach dropped. "Go," he whispered fiercely to the children, pointing toward a gap in the tree line 30 yards to their left, deep shadow that would swallow them from view within a few strides. "Run for those trees and keep running until you reach a cabin with a light on. Do not look back." Nora's older brother hesitated, looking back toward Veer's struggling form near the ship. "What about him?" the boy asked. "He came to save us too." Walter's throat tightened. "I'll help him," he said, forcing conviction into his voice, even as fear threatened to swallow it whole. "But I can't do that and protect you at the same time. Please, go now." The boy nodded, grabbing his siblings' hands, and the 3 of them broke into a sprint toward the tree line, small shapes vanishing quickly into the shadows, exactly as Walter had instructed. He watched them go for only a heartbeat before turning back toward the quarry, toward Veer, toward the third figure now striding purposefully in his direction, its long arm already rising to aim. Walter dove behind the rusted shed just as a beam of white light tore through the metal wall behind him, close enough that he felt the heat of it against his neck. His ears rang from the force of it, and for a moment, pure animal panic threatened to overtake every rational thought in his head. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to remember every lesson he had ever learned about staying calm under pressure during his years working search and rescue as a ranger. He peered around the shed's corner and saw the figure advancing steadily, unhurried, confident in a way that chilled him more than outright aggression would have. It clearly viewed him as no threat at all, an inconvenience to be dealt with before returning attention to Veer. who was still struggling to rise near the ship, dark fluid now soaking through most of its side. Walter raised his rifle, hands shaking, and fired. The shot cracked loud across the quarry, and the figure staggered, more from surprise than injury it seemed, its attention snapping fully onto Walter for the first time. It let out a harsh, grating sound, something between a screech and a growl, and raised its weapon again, this time aimed directly at him with no hesitation at all. Walter threw himself sideways as the beam scorched the ground where he had stood, rolling hard against the gravel, his rifle skidding out of his grip several feet away. He scrambled toward it, heart hammering, fully expecting the next shot to end everything, when a sudden blur of motion crashed into the figure from the side. Ver had closed the distance while the figure's attention had been locked on Walter, tackling it to the ground with a desperate, brutal strength that seemed to cost every last reserve of energy Ver had left. The two of them struggled in the dirt, and Walter scrambled back to his rifle, raising it, just as Ver managed to pin the figure's weapon arm against the ground. "Now," Ver shouted, its voice strained and breaking. "Please, now." Walter did not hesitate. He fired again, and this time the shot found its mark, and the figure beneath Ver went still. Ver rolled off it immediately, gasping, collapsing onto its back in the dirt, chest heaving with ragged, uneven breaths. Walter rushed to its side, dropping to his knees, fear for the strange creature that had saved his life, now outweighing every ounce of confusion he had felt just hours earlier. "Ver," he said urgently. "Ver, stay with me. We need to move. There's still 2 more of them out there." Ver's dark eyes fluttered, focusing on Walter with visible effort. "The children," Ver rasped. "Did they?" "They're safe," Walter said quickly. "They're headed for the tree line right now. We need to get you moving too. Come on." Before Ver could respond, a sharp, commanding voice rang out from near the ship, and Walter's head snapped up to see the remaining 2 figures turning away from their positions, weapons lowering slightly, as their attention shifted toward something Walter could not see, something in the sky above them that made both figures freeze in place. A new light was descending, faster and brighter than anything Walter had seen that night, cutting through the clouds with an intensity that lit up the entire quarry in stark white brilliance. The 2 remaining figures exchanged what looked like a frantic, wordless communication before scrambling back toward their ship with obvious urgency, abandoning the tripod device and the fallen third figure without a second glance. "What is that?" Walter breathed, helping Ver to a sitting position, both of them watching in stunned silence as the new light grew larger, resolving slowly into the unmistakable shape of another craft, sleeker and larger than either ship already on the ground, descending with a controlled, purposeful grace that spoke of far greater power than anything they had faced so far that night. Ver's exhausted face shifted through several expressions at once, fear giving way slowly, hesitantly, to something that looked almost like disbelief, almost like hope. "That," Ver said slowly, staring up at the descending light with wide, wondering eyes, "is not one of them." The 2 remaining figures scrambled aboard their dark ship in obvious panic, and within seconds its engines flared to full power, lifting it off the ground in a violent rush of displaced air that sent loose gravel scattering across the quarry floor. Walter shielded his eyes against the sudden gust, one arm still braced under Ver's shoulder, holding the wounded creature upright, as the fleeing ship banked sharply and shot skyward, vanishing into the clouds within seconds. "It's getting away," Walter said, frustration cutting through his exhaustion. "They're just going to escape." "They will not get far," Ver said, watching the new light continue its steady, unhurried descent toward the quarry. "My people do not chase blindly. They corner." As if in answer, a distant flash lit the clouds far above the ridge, followed a heartbeat later by a low, rolling boom that echoed across the valley, different from the sharp crack of a weapon, deeper and more final. Ver's tense shoulders eased slightly, and something close to relief passed over its exhausted features. "They did not escape after all," Ver murmured. The larger craft touched down at the quarry's edge with barely a sound, its hull humming with a soft golden light, entirely unlike the cold blue and amber Walter had seen from the other 2 ships that night. A section of its surface folded open smoothly, and 2 figures emerged, taller even than Ver, moving with calm, deliberate purpose, rather than the sharp aggression Walter had witnessed from the traffickers. They approached Veer and Walter without hesitation, and the moment the nearer of the two saw Veer's injuries, its posture shifted into something Walter could only describe as concern, an expression so recognizably compassionate that it startled him more than anything else he had witnessed that night. Veer spoke rapidly in that same sharp musical language from before, gesturing toward the fallen figure near the ship, toward the quarry, toward the direction the children had run. The taller figure listened intently, occasionally glancing toward Walter with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between gratitude and careful assessment. "They say the two who fled will be intercepted before they leave this system," Veer translated, wincing as one of the new arrivals knelt beside it and pressed something small and glowing against the wound at its side. "They also say the children's rescue and the destruction of the third trafficker will be reported to those who oversee such matters. This will not be treated lightly." Walter exhaled a long, shuddering breath, the adrenaline that had carried him through the past hour finally beginning to drain away, leaving his legs weak and his hands trembling uncontrollably. He looked toward the tree line where the children had vanished, sudden fresh worry flooding through him. "I need to find them," he said. "Make sure they're really safe. Get them somewhere warm. Call for real help, actual doctors and their families." Veer nodded, allowing the healer to continue tending its wound. "Go," Veer said. "I am safe now. You have done more tonight than most beings do in a lifetime. Go make sure they know it is truly over." Walter hesitated only a moment before turning and jogging toward the tree line, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly with each stride. He found the children exactly where he hoped, huddled together beneath a low pine branch just inside the tree line, close enough to have watched most of what happened in the quarry, far enough to have stayed hidden as instructed. Nora's older brother stood the moment he saw Walter's light, positioning himself protectively in front of his siblings until he recognized who it was. "It's over," Walter said, breathless, dropping to his knees in front of them. "It's over. You're safe. All three of you. I promise." The younger boy finally broke, crying openly now that the danger had passed, and Nora wrapped her arms around him, while her older brother allowed his own carefully held composure to crack at last, tears streaking silently down his dirt-smudged face. Walter gathered all three of them into an awkward, careful hug, feeling his own eyes burn as the weight of the night finally caught up with him too. "We need to get you somewhere safe, and call your families," Walter said gently, once the worst of the tears had passed. "Can you walk a little further with me? My truck isn't too far from here." They nodded, and together the small group made their way back through the woods toward Walter's cabin, the older boy occasionally glancing behind them with a mixture of fear and awe that Walter understood completely. By the time they reached his truck, the eastern sky had begun to lighten with the first faint hints of dawn, and Walter felt as though he had aged a decade in the span of a single night. The following hours blurred together in a haze of activity that Walter would later struggle to fully recall in order. He drove the children into town, called the local sheriff's office the moment he had signal, and within 20 minutes, his quiet cabin driveway filled with patrol cars, their lights washing red and blue across the tree line. The children were examined by paramedics, wrapped in warm blankets, and reunited with sobbing, disbelieving parents who had spent 2 agonizing days fearing the worst. Walter gave his statement carefully, describing a confused pursuit through the woods after noticing suspicious activity near the old camp, describing how he had stumbled upon the hidden bunker and later the quarry, describing enough truth to account for the rescue without mentioning wounds, wrecked ships, or wounded creatures from beyond the stars. He was not sure anyone would have believed him even if he had tried to explain the whole truth, and some quiet instinct told him that certain parts of this night were not his to share. The sheriff, a steady, weathered woman named Ellen Whitfield who Walter had known for over a decade, studied him carefully as he finished his account, her sharp eyes lingering a beat too long on details that did not quite add up, on the scorched patches of earth near the quarry that no one could adequately explain, on the strange metallic debris later found scattered through the woods near his cabin, that investigators would eventually classify, with visible reluctance, as unidentified fallen satellite material. "You got lucky out there, Walter," Ellen said quietly, once the chaos had settled enough for a private moment between them. "Real lucky. 3 kids alive because of what you did tonight." Walter thought of Ver, bleeding in the dirt behind his cabin, only hours before, of a promise made and honored between two strangers who should never have understood each other at all. Luck had very little to do with it, he thought, though he only nodded in response, unwilling to explain further. It was nearly noon before Walter finally found a quiet moment alone, the sheriff's cars gone, the reporters who had begun gathering at the edge of his property finally dispersed after a brief, carefully worded statement about a foiled trafficking operation uncovered by a local resident. He walked slowly back toward the woods behind his cabin, toward the clearing where everything had begun, half expecting to find nothing there at all, half fearing he had imagined the entire impossible night. The wreckage was gone. Not destroyed, not hidden beneath fallen branches, simply gone, as though it had never crashed there at all, leaving behind only a scorched circle of grass, slowly beginning to spring back upright in the afternoon sun. Walter stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, staring at the empty space, wondering if he would ever know what had truly happened to Ver, whether the healer's efforts had been enough, whether Ver's own people had judged its actions that night as bravery or reckless failure. He got a partial answer 3 nights later. Walter had fallen into an uneasy sleep on his porch, unable to shake the restless energy that had settled into his bones since that night, when a soft, familiar hum stirred him awake. He opened his eyes to find a faint blue light pulsing gently at the edge of his yard, and his breath caught as a tall, familiar shape stepped forward from the shadows, moving without the pained stagger of before, standing tall and steady beneath the stars. "Ver," Walter breathed, rising quickly from his chair. "I wish to see you once more before I return to my duties," Ver said, its voice stronger now, healed, though still carrying that same careful, deliberate cadence. "To thank you properly. What you did that night, a being with no knowledge of my kind, no reason to trust a stranger who nearly ended your life at the edge of your own home, was an act of courage my own people rarely witness, even among their own." Walter felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said quietly. Ver's dark eyes studied him for a long moment. "That is precisely why it mattered so much," Ver said. "Not every world produces beings who act on instinct to protect strangers, human or otherwise. Your world is young, and it is watched more closely than you know, by both those who would protect it and those who would exploit it. Tonight proved something important about what this world contains." "Did they find the other two?" Walter asked. "The ones who got away?" "They did not get away," Ver said simply. "And the network they served has been weakened, though not destroyed. There will be others, elsewhere, targeting other young worlds. That fight does not end easily, but this world, at least for now, has been marked as protected, watched over, no longer an easy target for those who prey on the unprepared." Walter absorbed this slowly, staring up at the star-filled sky above his quiet property, a sky he would never again look at the same way. "Will I see you again?" he asked, surprising himself with how much he hoped the answer would be yes. Ver's expression shifted into something Walter could only interpret as a smile, unfamiliar on such an alien face yet unmistakable in its warmth. "Perhaps," Ver said. "My duties carry me across many worlds, and I do not often return to any of them. But should this world ever need protecting again, and should you ever find yourself standing between danger and those who cannot defend themselves, know that somewhere among the stars there are those who remember what you did here and who would come again if called." Before Walter could respond, a soft light bloomed at the edge of the clearing, and Ver stepped backward into it, its form dissolving gently into brightness, before fading entirely, leaving Walter alone once more, beneath a sky that suddenly felt vast and full of unseen watchers, in a way it never had before. In the weeks that followed, Walter returned slowly to the rhythms of his quiet life, though nothing about it felt quite as small or ordinary as it once had. He visited the 3 children often, watching with quiet pride as they began to heal, as laughter slowly returned to replace the haunted look he remembered from that first terrifying night in the equipment shed. Nora's family invited him to dinner more times than he could count, and the older boy, whose name he learned was Peter, began visiting his cabin on weekends, peppering him with questions about that night that Walter carefully, gently deflected, unwilling to burden a child already carrying enough weight with a truth too large for anyone to easily hold. The old summer camp was torn down entirely within the month the hidden bunker sealed and filled, the quarry fenced off and monitored more closely by local authorities who never quite managed to explain every detail of what they found there. Walter kept his silence about the parts that mattered most, content to let the world believe what it needed to believe, while carrying the fuller truth quietly within himself, a truth he suspected would remain his alone for the rest of his life. Some nights, when the wind moved just right through the trees behind his cabin, Walter found himself walking out to that same clearing, standing where the wreckage had once smoldered, staring up at a sky that no longer felt distant or empty. He began keeping a small lantern lit on his back porch every evening after that, a quiet, steady light burning against the dark, not out of any real expectation that Veer or anyone like Veer would ever return, but simply as a small, private acknowledgement of everything that single terrifying night had taught him. That courage did not always announce itself in comfortable, familiar shapes. That protection sometimes came from the most unexpected places, wrapped in forms too strange to have ever been imagined beforehand. And that somewhere, far beyond the reach of his small, quiet corner of the world, there were still those willing to cross unimaginable distances to answer a simple, desperate question, one that had changed everything the moment it was screamed into a dark and frightened night. Did you harm human children? He had answered honestly that night, and in doing so, had found himself pulled into a truth far larger than anything he had ever expected his quiet life to hold. Walter Higgins never spoke of that night to anyone beyond the small, trusted circle who already understood pieces of it, but he carried its lesson with him every single day that followed, a lesson written plainly across the scorched grass of a clearing that, no matter how many seasons passed, never quite grew back the same as before.